Special Assistant for the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. He was appointed as a Tax Division Liaison to the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force in the Pacific region, for which he helped to prosecute large narcotics trafficking rings. Also during this time, he was detailed to Sierra Leone to conduct post-Civil War justice assessments for the Department of Justice, His Office of Overseas Prosecuting Development Assistance and Training. In 2003, he joined the Criminal Division Office for Special Investigations, where he helped to investigate and prosecute Nazi war criminals and modern human rights violators. Gregory has been quoted all over the media, widely published. He's publishing a new book coming out soon. I hear rumors with Oxford University Press, but I'm not sure. And I'll just say one other thing. I can go on and read for an hour his resume, which I won't. But I'll just say that on some of the issues that are important to our center, looking at radical Islam and the ideology of radical Islam, and certainly the Iranian revolutionary regime's ideology, Greg has been instrumental in his work on incitement to genocide, and some of the people in our community that we hear speak about the issues, like Dershowitz and Kotler and Elie Wiesel. It's this guy that did the legwork, sort of behind the scenes quietly in North Dakota, on these issues that have resonated internationally. So on that score, it's especially also gratifying to have you here. And today, Greg will speak about domestic issues. As Greg pointed out yesterday, ISGAP looks at issues of anti-Semitism globally. We're certainly concerned about radical Islam and what's changing in Europe and the silence in the West, particularly among scholars and the media of record. But often that's overlooked to some of the domestic situations. And Greg has a very important and interesting case study of things that are shifting kind of right below our noses here.
Thank you, Charles, for that generous introduction. And I'm honored again to be among you. And yesterday, to have had the pleasure as well to present with Professor Meekman from Yad Vashem. Today, I'm going to talk again about the enemy within, a neo-Nazi takeover in the American heartland. As a resident of North Dakota, this is an issue that has become incredibly important to me. I normally focus on international issues. I am an international criminal law expert, but I could not turn my eyes away from what was happening in my own state, and that is the genesis of this. As well, as Charles pointed out, ISGAP focuses so much on the new anti-Semitism, the idea of communicating socially acceptable, in quotation marks, Jew hatred by attacks on Israel throughout the world. But the old anti-Semitism continues to thrive right here in ISGAP's home country, in the United States, via various neo-Nazi groups, including the National Socialist Movement, which I'll be talking a lot about, and the Creativity Religion. And it's kind of come to a new level of threat, in my opinion, through what's known as the Pioneer Little Europe movement, which tries to establish white supremacist enclaves that would exclude Jews and blacks and other minorities in them, in the effort, of course, to try to turn the United States into, if you will, the Fourth Reich. And so I think, this series, I think this is still part, I'm going to assume this is still part of the Anti-Semitism and Comparative Perspective seminar series. This is just another presentation within it. And so I think it's fitting that we explore this issue here, as it's not something that ISGAP normally focuses on. Again, why am I so concerned about this issue? It's affected my home state. There has been a movement in the town of Leith, North Dakota, to take over the town by neo-Nazis and create one of these Pioneer Little Europe enclaves. And so what I want to talk about today is partly historical, partly a question of bringing to light current events, but I also want to talk about some of the legal issues. As I am a law professor, that's inevitably where my mind goes. And I find that the situation is unacceptable, and I wonder if it can be stopped. And what could we do from a legal perspective, perhaps, to thwart this movement? And if not, what could be the consequences? So what I propose is, first of all, to talk a little bit about really what is the history of the American Nazi movement, but I'll focus in particular on the National Socialist movement and the creativity movement in the American heartland. Then I'll talk about this more recent development of the Pioneer Little Europe movement, and then focus specifically on how that has affected Leith, North Dakota, and has gotten the state of North Dakota into quite a precarious position, and how the state and, to some extent, how some legal scholars have proposed that we can deal with this, and finally, why this issue is so important. And in terms of how we can deal with it, I want to talk about the problems that exist in the current law, but I also want to talk about reforms that we can make. And as you all know, from what Charles said, my expertise is international hate speech law, and so it's gratifying to some extent for me to take that expertise and talk about domestic hate speech and how we might change our laws to some extent to be in accord with international hate speech law. Let me start with, if you will, and I say this in quotation marks, the religious side of things, the creativity movement, the latest of several incarnations of a racist group that purports to be a religion, that was originally called the Church of the Creator. It was founded in 1973 by neo-Nazi Ben Klassen. And the movement promotes what it sees as the inherent superiority and what it calls creativity of the white race. It's hard to call this a theology, and later on I'm going to talk about what the Supreme Court has said constitutes a religion, and I'm going to argue that I don't think this is a religion. But if you want to call it a theology, it focuses on Jews and non-whites being what they call mud races, and they view Jews as sort of the leader of these mud races, that they have an intent on subjugating whites. And so their credo is, and their goal is to destroy and banish all Jewish thought and influence from our society. It was interesting yesterday to hear Professor Michman talk about how the Holocaust was about just that, banishing Jewish thought and influence from society, not just the physical destruction of the Jews, and we see that here. Many of these neo-Nazis meet untimely ends, as perhaps is befitting their activities. And Klassen committed suicide in 1993. The Church of the Creator almost folded, but it was brought back by an infamous individual. Some of you may have heard of him by the name of Matt Hale. And he resurrected the group and renamed it the World Church of the Creator, and in the process gave himself the title of Pontifex Maximus, meaning high priest. There he is with the logo of the group, which, as you can see with the W, is all about how the white race is superior to every other race. Unfortunately for Hale, there was another group, a church in the Pacific Northwest, that had previously trademarked this name, and so they sued Hale. And the judge who presided over this case, Judge Joan Lefkow, who was married to a Jewish man, ruled in the non-racist church's behalf, which infuriated Hale enough to suggest to the group's security chief, who happened to be a federal informant, unfortunately for him, that he murdered the judge. And this ended up leading to him being convicted on account of solicitation of murder, 3 counts of obstruction of justice. He ended up getting a 40-year federal prison sentence, and again, the church was on the verge of collapse. I would note that a year after this ruling, Judge Lefkow's husband and mother were murdered after a break-in, and I have to say that many creativity adherents had been calling for Judge Lefkow to be murdered and gave out her address. And one of them is someone who I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation by the name of Craig Cobb. It appears that the people who killed Judge Lefkow's mother and husband were not creativity adherents, but nevertheless this is a chilling reminder of how violent these people can be and how serious they are about wanting to inflict violence on Jews and blacks and other minorities. Let me now talk about the other part of this that's central to what's going on in the heartland, which is the rise of the National Socialist movement. It's one of the largest and most prominent neo-Nazi groups in the United States. The Southern Poverty Law Center reports that it has 61 chapters in 35 states. It's notable for its violent anti-Jewish rhetoric, its racist views, its provocative protests, which I'll talk about one in Toledo in a moment, and its policy allowing members of other racist groups to join the NSM while remaining members of other groups. That's what's really scary, is that the NSM kind of represents a group attempt to consolidate the neo-Nazi movement in the United States, because there has been a fair amount of fragmentation. The Pioneer Little Europe movement represents a geographical attempt at consolidation. And as I conclude my talk, I'm going to say at the end that my concern is that this consolidation could lead to greater power, and it's something that we have to be concerned about. But I would say that it was largely overshadowed in its early years. It was founded in 1974. You had groups like the National Alliance and the Aryan Nations. These were the big neo-Nazi groups in the United States, and the National Socialist movement, or what it was called back then, was somewhat small. But those other groups imploded in recent years, and the NSM started to take over. And let me just give you a little bit of background to help you understand how the NSM has been able to thrive. Its roots actually go back to the original American Nazi Party. So if we look at the NSM today, we can go all the way back to the beginning of the American Nazi Party movement, founded by former Navy Commander George Lincoln Rockwell, who we see in the top photograph in the middle there. Another infamous neo-Nazi who met an untimely demise, Rockwell was murdered by one of his own followers in 1967, and two of his chief lieutenants, Robert Brannan and Cliff Harrington, formed the National Socialist American Workers' Freedom Movement in St. Paul, Minnesota. And if you look at your geography, Minnesota is right next to North Dakota, and that's again why this strikes so close to home for us. The key event, though, and what really has caused the National Socialist movement to take off, is that leadership was passed on to Jeff Scoop in 1994, and he renamed it the National Socialist Movement. We see Scoop in the bottom photo there. And what really started to help the NSM take off is that Scoop was young, and he realized that the old American Nazi Party movement was getting old and that it could die out. So he wanted to recruit young, new membership. And with the demise of the National Alliance's William Pierce in 2002, Aryan Nation's Richard Butler in 2004, Scoop was only 21 years old, and he starts to set up a unit specifically focused on recruiting teens, and he calls it the Viking Youth Corps. Kind of sounds like one of those old Waffen-SS units. And then he also launches a women's division. He wants to get women more involved. We see a photo of his wife or girlfriend trying to make it look fashionable to be a Nazi, and further trying to attract youth with an online presence. They set up a website with a newsletter, downloadable leaflets, field reports from NSM chapters around the country, and then they even create their own hate rock music label called NSM 88 Records, the 88 being the number of letters, 8 of course being the 8th letter in the alphabet, HH for Heil Hitler. And in April 2007 they purchased the now popular white supremacist social networking site New Saxon. So they're really trying to recruit youth and get more technologically savvy. Although their ideology is the same old ideology that we've seen since the time of Hitler, and therefore reflects the American Nazi Party ideology. They openly idolize Adolf Hitler. They describe him in their propaganda as our Führer, the beloved Holy Father of our age, a visionary in every respect, and they call for a greater America that would deny citizenship to Jews, non-whites, and homosexuals. This is their view of America as the Fourth Reich. And they have, of course, they were founded in the Heartland, and they focused a lot of their efforts in the Heartland. In the Midwest, they have gone to various towns They've tried to create disturbances. Most prominently, they made international headlines after a planned march through a black neighborhood in Toledo, Ohio, which sparked rioting that cost the city more than $336,000. I would note that in connection with that, African Americans who complained about Scoop being there, he called them animals and other terrible things, tried to dehumanize them for complaining about these neo-Nazis coming into their neighborhood and terrorizing them. Minnesota, again, which is where this movement was founded, and which is right next door to where I live, has been the scene of some terrible NSM rallies, including book burnings, which were meant to glorify one of the Third Reich's favorite activities. And you can see here, I've got some images from some of these book burnings. You can see any books related to Judaism. You can see kind of in the left corner there a book on Judaism that's being burnt. Here we have a book on Israel. It's kind of hard to see in this light, but that middle where those bright flames are is a book. You can kind of see Israel above that if you look closely. It's extremely violently anti-Jewish. And then, of course, as I say, they start to get the idea that they geographically can consolidate their power base by forming these communities through the Pioneer Little Europe movement. This was an idea that was first proposed in 2001 in a pamphlet by H. Michael Barrett that was titled Pioneer Little Europe Prospectus, which envisioned consolidating white residents in existing cities and towns and actively repelling racial minorities, Jews. It's been based primarily in Montana, where its leader, April Gade, has implored fellow white supremacists to move to Montana and form Pioneer Little Europe movements or communities there. And one of the neo-Nazis in the United States who apparently was attracted to this was a guy named Craig Cobb, who I alluded to before. So what is the connection between Craig Cobb, the Pioneer Little Europe movement, the National Socialist movement, and creativity? That's what we're about to explore. And it begins with an unusual bit of activity in the town of Leith, North Dakota. In 2012, someone started buying properties in Leith, which at the time was, you see different numbers. Population 19, population 16. I've seen it as high more recently as 24. But these properties were being bought sight unseen, and the person ended up buying more than a dozen lots for a few $100s each, right? These are very cheap, mostly from landowners who lived elsewhere in the country. These were like absentee landlords. And of course, this person turned out to be Craig Paul Cobb, age 61, who moved into one of the properties himself, one that he purchased for $5,000, so one of the more upscale properties. But this was a ramshackle two-story house without running water. And then he announced on a white supremacist online forum that he intended to build an all-white, non-Jewish enclave of racists in North Dakota. The Southern Poverty Law Center got wind of this and started to spread the word, and so it became a national, if you will, cause célèbre. It's actually been covered in the international press. I recently read a story on this in the BBC. But his avowed purpose was to create a Pioneer Little Europe in Leith. And again, I think it's important to realize that places like Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, North Dakota, these are considered appealing places for this movement because of a pretty homogeneous population. There's less racial diversity, higher percentage of Caucasians live in these states. And he figured that he could bring enough people into this area. People probably think North Dakota is largely deserted. What there is, there are white people. We can create an enclave here. And what he wanted to make, if you will, the capital of this, his town, which he would convert Leith, North Dakota, into Cobbsville. We can see a couple of his followers in front of his house with a Confederate flag. Let me give you a little bit of background on Cobb. He's a fascinating figure. He was reportedly born in 1951 to a well-to-do family. The BBC report that I read recently said that his father was a millionaire. He was an architect and land developer, supposedly, and his mother was an elementary school teacher. So he had this, what would seem to be a normal upbringing. I don't think there's any history of his parents or his family being involved with Nazi movements or racist movements. He went to a private boarding school in Boston, where he graduated in 1968. And somewhere along the way, he formed a favorable impression of the American Nazi leader George Lincoln Rockwell and former Third Reich Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, and he began to embrace Nazi ideology, white supremacist ideology. Supposedly he served in the armed forces. For some reason moved to Edmonton, Canada for a few years, and then relocated to Hawaii, where he lived and worked as a taxi driver. He claims to have had Barack Obama as one of his fares, and he claims that the president told him that he was not born in the United States. I think you have to take that with a big grain of salt. In 2003, he allegedly pulled up stakes and moved to Frost, West Virginia, where he reportedly opened a grocery store and subsequently registered a business called Gray Store Aryan Autographs and 14 Words LLC. And during this time, he was also allegedly involved in interstate deliveries of a neo-Nazi newspaper published by Alex Linder, another one of the prominent neo-Nazis in the country, who operates a white power online anti-Semitic forum called the Vanguard News Network, or VNA. He also, Cobb did, supposedly distributed Project Schoolyard CDs to local children, which is essentially hate music that he was distributing to middle and high school kids. For some reason, he decides that he gets the idea that an ideal place to start an all-white supremacist enclave would be in Estonia. So he moves to Tallinn, Estonia in 2005, and he sets up a video sharing service for white supremacists called Pod Blanc that allows him to record himself issuing racist rants. And actually, this right here is one of those. This is what it looks like when he's issuing his racist rants on Pod Blanc. What he wanted to do was form alliances with skinheads in the area, and he purchased land 30 miles south of the capital. And again, he wants to form an international office of white diaspora. This is sort of the more international version of the Pioneer Little Europe that he's trying to do in the United States. The difference is, and I'm going to talk about this when I talk about the fact that the United States really can't do a lot about it. In Estonia, they have laws that will prevent this sort of thing from happening, and they deport Cobb to Canada in connection with his racist speech and activities in Estonia. So he moves to Vancouver. So reportedly he continues his online racist and anti-Semitic activities, and the Canadians are able to charge him with willful promotion of hatred for his internet endeavors, but he flees Canada before he can be brought to trial. Now, let me give you a little bit of background about the Canadians, because I think it's relevant to what I want to propose later on, which is that the Canadians have laws that can allow for prosecution of people who are promoting hatred against an identifiable or protected group, or for incitement against those groups. The landmark case of Regina versus Keekstra from 1990 found the Canadian Supreme Court upholding Section 319 of the Canadian Criminal Code, which allows these prosecutions, finding that it was constitutional under the freedom of expression provision in Section 2B of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I would also note that Section 113 of the Canadian Human Rights Act prohibits the communication of messages that likely expose a person to hatred or contempt based on race, national, ethnic origin, color, religion, age, sex, sexual orientation, and all these protected categories, and provides for injunctions and money damages. I have to tell you, though, that the Canadians voted last year to repeal this statute, and it will no longer be in effect after June 2014. So you have somewhat of an interesting situation that the Canadians can apply their criminal laws to people who engage in this kind of speech activity, but not civil laws. But that's the way it is in Canada right now. Should we move towards something like that in the US? We'll talk about that. So let's go back to Cobb. He flees the Canadians because he doesn't want to get prosecuted. He supposedly returns to Montana's Flathead Valley, which is where April Gate is located, and she's the one who's promoting the Pioneer Little Europe movement. She's one of the founders. And so Cobb sort of gets that idea in his head, right? It was somewhat similar to what he wanted to do in Estonia. And he also realizes that in neighboring North Dakota, there is this booming oil and gas business that is going on. You all may have heard of the oil patch in North Dakota and the Bakken. There is a lot of money being made. It's good for my state. It tends to assure that I get a raise every year, and I have tremendous job security. Nothing like having tenure at the University of North Dakota these days. But unfortunately, it's attracting people that aren't quite as savory, and Cobb was among them. He reportedly began working on a road construction crew, which he also supposedly was terminated from. But he started to believe, well, you know what, maybe I don't need that job, because he found Leith, North Dakota, he had a little money, and obviously for a few $100s per lot, he could start buying up the parcels in Leith that I talked about earlier. And that kind of brings us full circle to what he started to do. What is Leith? Leith is a town in Grant County, North Dakota. I'll go back to where it was on the map in North Dakota. You can see where that A is, that red A. It's sort of in the western part of the state, close to where the oil patch is. And so it's got 16, 19, 24, estimates vary, not many people. Interestingly, there is an African American living in the town who lives right across an alleyway from Cobb. He's the only black resident in the town, and he's married to a white woman. He has tried to be tolerant, but Cobb has made it clear that he doesn't want people like Bobby Harper around there. I would also point out that North Dakota, while not in any way resembling New York City, still has a very nice Jewish community and a decent-sized one in Bismarck, which is pretty close to Leith. And so these activities have been alarming to the Jewish community, and since I'm here in this gap today, I think it's worth pointing out. So this guy is sort of a terror in western North Dakota. And what really is scary is that what he's trying to do is he's trying to bring in all of the, if you will, the luminaries of the neo-Nazi movement in the United States to Leith, North Dakota. So Tom Metzger, who many of you would have heard of, who was the former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan and now leads a group known as White Aryan Resistance or WAR, he purchased a lot for $1 from Cobb in June 2012. 4 months later, Alex Linder, who I mentioned earlier, who runs the VNN, he did the same thing. Cobb donated buildings in Leith to the National Socialist Movement, as we know, which was run by Jeff Scoop. And according to an August post on the hate site Stormfront, April Gade and her husband Mark Harrington also own property in Leith, North Dakota. So he's trying to consolidate the neo-Nazi movement in the United States in Leith, North Dakota. I point out as an aside here that he reportedly also said he wanted to transfer property to the Greek ultranationalist political party Golden Dawn, as well as former Klansman and Louisiana State Representative David Duke. So he wants everybody in the Nazi movement to come to Leith, North Dakota, and it looks like he's succeeding. He's been posting on the White Nations Forum, continuing to try to lure other white supremacists to come to Leith. He's posted about the great economic situation in North Dakota, the availability of jobs given the oil and gas boom, and how Dickinson, which is really where a lot of the hub of that activity is very close to Leith, and it's also close to Bismarck. And he's posted pictures of his plans for the town, including putting up a photo showing the site where he intends to create the Dr. William L. Pierce Private Park of Leith, who is the former leader of the neo-Nazi National Alliance I talked about a little bit earlier. So this is his idea for Leith. Well, finally, in September, people had had enough, and on September 22nd, about 400 people converged on Leith to protest Cobb's plans. The rally was planned by a group called Unite ND, which was created by a group called Anti-Racist Action, or ARA. This point came up yesterday in the Q&A at Columbia. A lot of Native Americans were involved in this protest, and of course they're affected by this too. I should note that. It's not a coincidence that they picked September 22nd, because this was scheduled to coincide with a visit from Jeff Scoop, as we know, head of the NSM, to support Cobb's plans. Scoop showed up with about a dozen NSM members wearing Nazi regalia, and they planted Nazi flags throughout the city, and they had a march through the town. And Scoop sent a letter to the mayor of Leith, Ryan Schock, before the visit, warning residents against standing up to the NSM and Cobb's plans, if you will, in my opinion, trying to intimidate everybody. And I quote him, "Craig Cobb will not be ousted from the community. Craig is not breaking any laws or ordinances. He has a right to reside in Leith just as any other American does. We are not asking you or any other residents of Leith to change whatever political stance you may or may not have. If anything, you should see this for what it is, a chance at revitalizing a community and a chance to be neighborly to your new neighbors and vice versa. So this is an interesting spin on what Cobb wants to do, but it's also a fascinating point, which is he may be right. Legally, as far as we can tell, I'm going to look at this in a little bit. On the surface, there's nothing wrong with what Cobb's doing. He's not breaking any laws. And yet, the town was feeling paralyzed and really not knowing what to do. However, the town started to fight back. It set up a website. It wanted to spread the word. First of all, it wanted to let the world know, we don't endorse this, we don't support this. We have no idea why this misfortune was visited on us. But they started this leithnd.com, and they said in the coming days, weeks, and months, we the citizens will endeavor to present a more realistic point of view as to our moral fiber and ties to the community. And it sought donations to deal with lawsuits that Cobb was threatening. And I'll tell you a little bit about the nature of those lawsuits in a moment. But it claimed that civil rights were being violated. There were also other local efforts. County health officials condemned Cobb's ramshackle house because it had no running water, and money was raised consistent with the website. They set up a fund to have money in case Cobb were to sue, and there was actually even discussion of dissolving the town of Leith so it could be incorporated into the county. So if Cobb tried to take over the city government, he wouldn't be able to do that. It would be the county that would be in control. So there are all these sort of, desperate measures that the town was trying to think of what it could do creatively to deal with this problem. And ultimately, they passed ordinances to deal with Cobb. I love this image of Cobb coming to one of the city council meetings and yelling at them. And they're telling him, hey, get out of here. He's spewing racial epithets at them and, calling them Jews and controlled by Jews, etc. And yet, they said, look, we don't care. We're going to pass some ordinances to deal with you. And they actually, one of them approved a moratorium on any new construction in the town because these neo-Nazis were planning to build on the lots that Cobb had sold them. And another ordinance prevented tents and campers from being set up on a city lot for more than 10 consecutive days, right? Because what was going to happen is these neo-Nazis were going to come in with tents and campers. They were going to build houses, and this was part of the plan. So this was a way to try to thwart that. Cobb, and maybe he had a point, called these ordinances patently unfair, and said residents of the town were evil and nasty. Why now, he asked. Is it a wonderful coincidence that the moment I show up, these measures are necessary? And so, obviously these seem to be desperate measures. Are they really effective measures? I think we need to ask ourselves that. The town was trying to do whatever it could within the law to deal with this scourge. And then I have to point out, things started to go downhill for Cobb. And the beginning of his problems was when he agreed to be on a TV show in the UK, the Trisha Show, which was hosted by a black British TV personality by the name of Trisha Goddard. And as part of the show, he submitted to a DNA test which revealed that he was 14% sub-Saharan African heritage. On TV, this was revealed, and it's great. Trisha came over and tried to give him a fist pump. He was not happy. You can kind of see that there. And he was humiliated. Even, within the neo-Nazi movement, when he came back to the United States, and people in Leith started to taunt him. So this was, he was really upset. So he made a mistake. He went out with one of his followers, a guy named Keenan Dutton, another neo-Nazi, and they went around with rifles, shotguns, and they terrorized the residents of Leith because they were so angry that they were suggesting that Cobb had African blood in him. And they were threatening them, racial epithets, anti-Semitic epithets. He claimed that he was reacting to threats from his fellow Leith citizens, but they weren't going around with guns. And he went too far, and he was arrested for terrorizing these residents. His bail was set at $1 million. He has not been able to post a bond for that amount, so he's currently awaiting trial in custody. The bond amount was reduced, but he still wasn't able to post. In January, just last month, Dutton pled guilty to a series of misdemeanors in exchange for testifying against Cobb at trial, and he's been released on probation. So Cobb's kind of on his own now, if you will, with respect to this criminal case. Let me point out, however, that Cobb has tried to strike back. He sued the North Dakota Attorney General. He filed a complaint against Wayne Stengham, our Attorney General, alleging discrimination against his creativity religion after the AG told a radio station, quote, "White supremacist Craig Cobb and his supporters are not the kind of people wanted in North Dakota." So he has sued. So that segues nicely into the legal issues that I think are raised by all this that I want to talk about now for the remainder of my chat, which is, let's assume Cobb hadn't been arrested for terrorizing the Leith residents with his firearm. What else could have been done to stop him from taking over this town with this little Pioneer Europe movement? I mean, he could have very well not gone out with his firearm, and his momentum would not have been stopped at all. And so I think we could ask ourselves, and he still might, we don't know, he still could get acquitted, we don't know, even if he's convicted, we don't know if he can get it overturned on appeal, we don't know what's going to happen. What if he ultimately succeeds in taking control over the town, governance, or other towns with his fellow neo-Nazis? Is there anything that can be done to protect the minorities who would be affected by this? And if current law cannot protect minorities, and if it cannot stop neo-Nazis from taking over towns like this, should the law be changed? And I want to talk about that a little bit. So I think there are some legal issues that we can consider pre-takeover. In other words, Cobb says, I'm going to take over this town. There's nothing you can do to stop me. Let's consider whether that's true. And I think we should look at the housing laws, the civil rights laws, also the issue of freedom of expression, and free exercise of religion, because as we've seen, of course, he claims that creativity is a religion, and he's being discriminated against. Let's start with the housing laws. It turns out that last month, the city attorney declared the Cobb's house could not be condemned, right, because they had originally condemned it, despite the fact that there's no sewage or running water, but it has been declared uninhabitable. So that's sort of a half measure that doesn't help a lot. The building, I will say though, the building moratorium and the tent trailer ordinance appear to stand up, but how effective is that? If these people had been wealthy enough to buy homes in Leith in the first place, then they wouldn't be stopped. He could buy up all the properties he wanted, and he could take over town government. So these seem like half measures. These seem like desperate efforts to find a creative way in the law to stop him. But other people, better heeled neo-Nazis, would certainly not face such obstacles. So the housing laws don't seem that promising. What about civil rights laws? Well, I mean, we can talk about this. My research seems to reveal that there are no laws to prevent a neo-Nazi or other hate group from buying up properties, threatening to exclude Jews, blacks, or other minorities, and taking over municipal governance. I'm not aware of any laws in the United States that would prevent that. So he seems to be free to go ahead and do that. A more interesting area is freedom of expression and the doctrine of fighting words, and I want to spend a little bit more time on that. We are all familiar probably with the First Amendment of the Constitution, which declares that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. One of our most sacred and important constitutional protections. Let me point out, however, that with respect to freedom of speech, there have been decisions that have found that it is not unlimited. Even though the United States is the most speech-protected country in the world, there is the case of Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire from 1942. And in that case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that fighting words are not accorded First Amendment protection, and fighting words were defined to include words which are likely to incite an immediate fight and words which inflict injury. And then we get a little bit of fleshing out of that doctrine in Beauharnais versus Illinois from 1952, where the Supreme Court upheld an Illinois law making it illegal to publish or exhibit any writing or picture portraying the depravity, criminality, unchastity, or lack of virtue of a class of citizens of any race, color, creed, or religion. So this seems like perhaps a promising doctrine, except unfortunately it gets watered down, if not completely neutered, by the case of Terman Yellow versus Chicago from 1949. I realize that Beauharnais is from 1952, and this is from 1949. But what ends up happening is Terminiello gets the better of the two decisions. In that case, the court held that to constitute fighting words, it was no longer enough that the speaker's words made the listeners angry. Rather, incitement to violence was now required. Terminiello, in that case, viciously criticized certain political and religious groups, and the crowd, which was upset by his comments, could not be controlled by the police. So the police arrested Terminiello for breach of the peace, but the Supreme Court ultimately overturned his conviction and held, and I quote, "The vitality of civil and political institutions in our society depends on free discussion. Free speech is supposed to incite dispute, and it is often provocative and challenging while it presses for acceptance. The most valuable expression may well be that which, because it is provocative and challenging, produces these emotions. Therefore, a state may not punish a person for rousing a crowd to act violently simply by initiating a public dispute." And we can see that this is something that we would call the heckler's veto. In other words, when members of the audience gain the right to silence any speaker with whom they disagree. And Terminiello essentially rejects the idea that the heckler's veto can work. Now, what Terminiello tells us is that it's not going to be enough simply to define fighting words the way Czaplinski did. It's going to have to mean that there is incitement to violence. The standard for incitement to violence was laid out by the U.S. Supreme Court in Brandenburg versus Ohio from 1969, where the court held that speech that incites to violence could be prosecuted criminally if it was intended to incite to imminent lawless violence and was reasonably likely to incite to imminent lawless violence, which is a very high standard. Okay? So Terminiello means that it's going to be very difficult for someone who gets up and makes horrific statements about minorities, Jews, blacks, Hispanics, for there to be any kind of legal action taken against them. There is, however, and let me explain how that played out in Skokie. You probably all have heard of the infamous march of the Nazis in Skokie, Illinois. And in the case of Skokie versus National Socialist Party in 1978, an Illinois case, it was found to be an especially strong state case, but it disallowed the fighting words rationale even in circumstances of extreme provocation and targeted insult in spite of Czaplinski. And in that case, a Nazi group planned to demonstrate in Skokie, which was a predominantly Jewish community, and about 5,000 of its residents were actually survivors of concentration camps. And just before the scheduled demonstration, the village enacted several ordinances designed to neutralize the demonstration, including one forbidding the dissemination of any materials which promote or incite racial or religious hatred. However, the court held that there was simply no principled way of distinguishing between this situation and speech that stirs listeners to unrest, which is exactly the kind of speech that was protected in Terminiello. So essentially, Terminiello acted as a shield to protect the Nazis when they wanted to protest in Skokie. And I think we have to wonder whether it's right that people who are carrying the swastika, who are bringing up Adolf Hitler and the memory of the Holocaust, can go into a place where survivors of the worst horrors of the Holocaust have come to the United States seeking haven and essentially terrorize them with this protest. But that's essentially what the free speech jurisprudence says right now. Now, there is, I'd say, a glimmer of hope, and that is something that we see in Virginia versus Black from 2003, a more recent case. The issue there presented was, does the Commonwealth of Virginia's cross-burning statute, which prohibits the burning of a cross with the intent of intimidating any person or group of persons, violate the First Amendment? And the court held yes. However, in a plurality opinion delivered by Justice O'Connor, the court held that while a state consistent with the First Amendment may ban cross-burning carried out with the intent to intimidate, the provision in this particular case of the Virginia statute treating any cross-burning as prima facie evidence of intent to intimidate renders the statute unconstitutional in its current form. The reason why I say there's a glimmer of hope here is that this plurality opinion pointed out that speech activity that seems to be carried out with intent to intimidate can be prosecuted. And so I would suggest to you that could be the opening that is needed to kind of bring us back to the roots of Chaplinsky and perhaps lower the standard that we find in Brandenburg versus Ohio. So let me get to the last issue before I get to that, which is related to the free exercise of religion, right? We just looked at the text of the First Amendment, and we saw that it protects the free exercise of religion. And the reason why this is relevant is that, as I mentioned earlier, Cobb has tried to use his religion, the so-called creativity religion, as a sword to deal with people who are trying to stop him from carrying out his plans. By essentially saying, hey, look, you know, you are violating my civil rights because I'm trying to practice my religion, which happens to be white supremacy and hatred of minorities, but it's a religion and you can't do that to me. And there are two cases that deal with this issue of whether creativity is a religion. And there's a split. In Peterson versus Wilmer Communications from the Eastern District of Wisconsin in 2002, a U.S. District Court found that the creativity religion constitutes a religion for purposes of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in that case, you had a person who, a neo-Nazi, who was saying that he was practicing the creativity religion and that he was discriminated against in his job. He was denied benefits or terminated in his job, and he claimed that that was because of his exercise of religion. And the court in that case found that yes, this is a religion. However, in Connor versus Tilton, 2009 case from the Northern District of California, a district court found that creativity did not qualify as a religion for First Amendment purposes. So the first case is decided under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The second case is decided under the First Amendment. However, the first case is published, the second case isn't. And so in terms of published cases, which have, of course, more authority and teeth, it would seem that creativity is considered to be a religion according to the case law. And so therefore, it would seem that neo-Nazis can use creativity as a sword for pursuing litigation against government officials who make statements or take actions against their initiatives. And I give you, as a case in point, the lawsuit that Cobb has filed against the North Dakota Attorney General Wayne Stenger. All right, so these are all the issues that I think come up in terms of what can we do or what are we dealing with before Cobb actually takes over the town. What about after he takes over the town? Well, here is where I think the law can start to do something. Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, the classifications that we looked at before, in programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. So assuming that Cobb were to take over the government and transform the policies of Leith, if you can show any money in any indirect way going to Leith, you can make the connection to Title VI, and therefore you can have a lawsuit because Cobb will be running afoul of Title VI. Regardless of whether Cobb assumes any governmental functions, which, by the way, would also implicate equal protection and due process clause issues, where I think he could be sued, as well as Title VI. Let's say he discriminates against people that he chooses to rent to or sell properties to. He would also run afoul of Title VIII of the 1968 Civil Rights Act, which is known as the Fair Housing Act, which renders it unlawful to discriminate in the sale or rental of housing because of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So, on the federal level, post-takeover, it definitely seems that there are remedies. Even on a state level, and I'm proud to say that North Dakota has these laws, although they don't apply to sexual orientation. And I want to say publicly that I'm ashamed of that. We ought to have protection for our LGBT fellow citizens. But with respect to these other classifications, if Cobb refused to sell or rent because of race, color, religion, sex, disability, age, familial status, or national origin, he would violate the North Dakota Housing Discrimination Act. And the North Dakota Human Rights Act forbids adverse discrimination in the provision of public accommodation or services based on the categories I just mentioned, minus sexual orientation. Again, hopefully we'll get that law fixed. So the problem is when we look at the laws, it seems that there's nothing that we can do during the takeover itself. And you know, if Cobb is just buying properties, bringing in his fellow neo-Nazis, taking over local government, terrified residents can't really do anything. They have to wait for Cobb's policies to be implemented, and then they're going to have to file lawsuits or initiate litigation. And we know that that takes time. We know how long it takes for things to work themselves through the court system. So, in the meantime, you've got an area that is dominated by neo-Nazis, raising the Nazi flag, renaming places after Adolf Hitler and Rockwell and all this, and people in the area can do nothing about it. And in the meantime, if they try to speak out against it, Cobb could presumably file a lawsuit, a civil rights lawsuit, claiming that he's being discriminated against on the grounds of his religion. So, I don't think that this is a good situation. I am not comfortable with this, and I think that something needs to change. So, this is what I propose. Let's amend the laws. Perhaps we can enact a civil rights law that aims to prevent something like this neo-Nazi takeover. If such groups have an avowed purpose to take over a town and thereby deprive citizens of their civil rights, I submit to you that the law should permit preventive action in the form of injunctions. Why should we sit around and wait and not be able to do anything while this terrible activity is taking place and terrorizing people in the area? And then, in accord with what I submit is the emerging doctrine from the Black case, I think Terminiello should be overruled, and I think that the holding in Beauharnais and Chaplinsky should be reinstituted, and that we should have actually a fighting words doctrine that has teeth. By the same token, I also think we should water down the standard for incitement that we see in Brandenburg versus Ohio. The other thing that I think we should be looking seriously at is whether or not we want to find that creativity is truly a religion. I think that that is a bunch of bunkum, and there is a test which determines whether or not a movement is quote-unquote a religion. And the prongs, there are three that we look at. Does it address fundamental and ultimate questions having to do with deep and imponderable matters? I just don't think saying that the white race is supreme and that anything that's good for the white race is a religion, to me that's not fundamental and ultimate questions having to do with deep and imponderable matters. Secondly, it's not going to be a religion if it's not comprehensive in nature and generally confined to one question or one moral teaching without laying claim to an ultimate and comprehensive truth. Again, I think the narrow claim that the white race is superior to any other race is just the kind of narrow question that is being dealt with in this movement that means it shouldn't qualify as a religion. And then finally, it does not include formal characteristics analogous to those of traditional religions. I think that one's maybe a little more difficult. There are some trappings of religion, including, as we saw, that big W with the, looked like a crown, which sort of shows that the white race is superior. But I don't think that that's akin to the kind of the symbols and the places of worship and things like that we see in what we would really call a religion. So I think if we either change the law more explicitly or initiate more litigation in the courts, we should be able to find that this is not a religion and therefore can't be used as a sword by the neo-Nazis. So why do I think all this matters? Well, let's assume again that Cobb is acquitted or that he serves his sentence. He has set his sights on taking over other towns in North Dakota. He has said that he's even looked at a town called Regan, which is in Burleigh County, that has a population of 43, and said, you know what, if it doesn't work out in Leith, I'll try there, or I'll try other places. Other neo-Nazis have been inspired by the Little Pioneer movement. For example, white supremacist Richard Bunk has allegedly been buying up properties in the tiny town of Rachel, Nevada, which is the doorstep of the infamous Area 51, perhaps not coincidentally, with a view of taking over town governance there. And neo-Nazi Paul Mullet announced on the Aryan Nations website that he was seeking donations to come up with a $5,000 deposit deposit needed to buy 15 acres of land in southern Tennessee to serve as a new Aryan Republic homeland. What my point is that little cells like this can multiply if we're not vigilant. The other thing that can happen is that these enclaves can gather and concentrate all of the major neo-Nazi groups together into one area, and that makes them more powerful. Right now, they're more splintered. And I think what's scary about the National Socialist movement and the Little Pioneer Europe movement is that they seek to consolidate both the groups and the geography of these neo-Nazi groups, potentially making them more powerful. And my concern is that while they may be somewhat hiding in the shadows now, if we have a major economic downturn or some other national or international calamity, they will have a solid base from which to recruit. They will have a good infrastructure, and God forbid we see a Fourth Reich, even if they make strides, significant strides in doing that in the United States. That is a prospect that I think we all would think would be horrific. And so I think we need to take this seriously. I think we need to consider changing the laws. And I would now open it up for your questions, and thank you for your attention. Yes?
You did not, as far as I heard, consider Kilo as a possible anodyne for this. Kilo being that the municipality, before he takes over, decidedly, would say, for the public weal, for the public good, we can absorb your home or your property or something because it's the greater good for the greater number of people, even though I hate Kilo normally. But Kilo for this application seems to be one possible route.